And I want to piggyback off of all this talk about sleep and sleep deprivation to segue into your favorite supplement, which is creatine.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot I want to get into here with you. Let's start off talking about that sleep deprivation piece, which to me seems like a newer piece to this. Typically, bodybuilders, for years have been using this to put on muscle mass and to have better workouts.
Yeah.
But let's just take it from the top. Sleep deprivation, what the research is showing, and then we'll go from there.
This idea of creatine being able to offset some of the effects of sleep deprivation, I think has come to the public consciousness in the last year or so, because there was a paper that came out that specifically looked at this. What they did is they gave people creatine after a night of sleep deprivation compared to a placebo, and they saw a restoration of sort of like energetics in the brain with a brain scan. And so that's like very similar to this effect of caffeine, right? Where you give caffeine, you can offset some of the negative effects of adenosine that's built up, and you can maintain energy production in the brain. But there was actually a study several years ago that looked at this in rugby players, where they gave them either caffeine or creatine after a night of sleep deprivation, and compared to a placebo, like a low dose of, or like a standard kind of maintenance dose of creatine, like 5 to 10 grams, it had the same effect on maintaining. They did like rugby skills. They did a rugby skills session in these rugby players after sleep deprivation, and both creatine and caffeine had the same benefit compared to a placebo in terms of maintaining those skills after sleep deprivation. That study didn't get nearly as much press as this other one, but this other one, they gave a bigger dose. It was more like sort of 20 to 30 grams of creatine, and saw it sort of offset this negative effect of sleep deprivation. What I think a lot of people have talked about, but there hasn't necessarily been, is sort of like super anecdotal for a long time now, until we've sort of seen more of these studies around sleep deprivation, is that for some people, creatine can be quite stimulating, and not necessarily stimulating in the same way as if you had like a whole bunch of espressos, but it can sort of increase alertness slightly. I think the mechanism is still a little bit debated. Like, nobody really knows exactly what it's doing. It's obviously, creatine is needed by cells to provide a buffer of energy sources, like a buffer of ATP in the phosphocreatine system. So it could partly be that. But for me, for a long time, if I work out in the afternoon, I would take my creatine after my workout, and then it's like right before dinner at like 5 or 6 p.m. And I would find I couldn't sleep as well. And so now I just have my creatine first thing in the morning, and that solved it. Other people don't have that issue. So there's obviously a little bit of personal experimentation that's required, but it does seem that creatine can be slightly stimulating, and because of that, it's offsetting some of the negative effects of sleep deprivation.
Okay. So it buffers energy. You talked about the two different studies, one being a lower dose, one being, I think you said the latter study was 20 to 30 grams.
Yeah.
Say you have a poor sleep and you want that benefit, how much will you take?
I generally take 10 grams a day. I don't manipulate that a lot. I just keep it the same, because I'm more likely to just remember to take it and not worry about moving it up and down. There are creatine researchers, like I know I've heard Darren Kandow. He's a big guy in the creatine research world. He says that he'll take 10 grams a day, but then when he's sleep deprived or he's jet lagged, he'll take 30 grams a day. And that probably aligns pretty well with the research that we've seen. But I think when they do a 30-gram study, they don't necessarily compare it to a 10-gram dose. Whereas in that rugby study, they compared a sort of a standard dose, like a 5 to 10-gram dose, to a bigger dose. It was probably around 30 grams, and they saw the same effect. So we're still trying to figure out exact doses. Sometimes they dose it by just grams. Sometimes they dose it by body weight. In reality, it's hard to know how much of a difference you're going to get by increasing dose. But I certainly know people who feel they get more benefit on days when they need it with a bigger dose. Is that placebo? Is it because it's actually giving you more benefit? If you think it's giving you benefit, then do it, because that's probably going to be good for you anyway, because then you believe you'll perform better. So I think we're still kind of figuring out exactly what that dosing scheme might look like.
Okay, so for you, about 10 grams a day in the morning.
Yeah.
Have you heard about this talk about creatine and caffeine being competitive for absorption? And if you have it with coffee, not getting the impact of the creatine?
I haven't heard that, and
Well, let me give you a bit more context.
Yeah, so
this isn't something I've dug into.
Sorry, there are different transporters in the gut. Like, they don't get taken up by the same transporters, as far as I know.
All I know is from one of my videos that's picked up a bit of steam. A lot of people are commenting under it the fact that you shouldn't be having the two together. But I don't know anything on the science about it, so I'm just curious.
Yeah, if somebody can send a mechanism like where they're competing with one another, I'd certainly love to see it. I haven't seen that. There are some data that suggest that once you get above about 10 grams, the creatine might start competing with itself for uptake. So the more you take, the smaller the percentage of that dose you're going to take up. So if you take 30 grams compared to 10 grams, yes, you'll take up more when you have 30 grams, but you might lose a bit more. You might have saturated the transporters, so some of that creatine just comes out the other end. So that's a possibility, is that with very big doses, you just don't end up absorbing it all. But I haven't seen the creatine versus caffeine thing. I don't think they're taken up by the same transporters, as far as I can tell, because they're quite different molecules.
Okay, we'll see what people say in the comments.
Yeah.
So given what you just said there about dosing, if somebody is sleep deprived and they want to use creatine to help with that, how would you space out the dosages if they want to hit, say, 30 grams in a day?
Yeah, so then it's probably, so in scenarios where you want to take bigger doses, and, some of the papers that we've published, we talked about creatine possibly after concussion. So then if you want to try and get as much creatine into the body as possible, then I would split your dose into like 3 doses of 10 grams a day, something like that.
The other thing I see in the YouTube comments is people talking about the kidneys and potential damage to the kidneys taking creatine. Any research showing that?
The reason why people think that is because of doctors who don't understand creatine physiology. And I can, I'm very confident in that statement, and I'll tell you why. So the reason why we think that creatine might damage the kidneys is because the most common marker of kidney function is a marker called creatinine. Creatinine you measure in the blood, and how much your kidneys reabsorb tells you something about how well your kidneys are functioning. So as your kidney function drops, so say if you have chronic kidney disease because you have diabetes, your creatinine will increase over time. Creatinine is produced as a byproduct of phosphorylating and using creatine in your cells. Every time you reuse a creatine molecule, some of it gets kicked out as creatinine, and so it accumulates in the blood, and the kidneys excrete it. As a result of that, creatinine is actually a much better marker of muscle mass than it is of kidney function. And you'll see as people get more and more muscle mass, their creatinine will increase, because it's telling you about the amount of creatine and how that creatine is being used in the muscles. But if you start taking more creatine, your creatinine will increase, because you've got more creatine and you're doing more with it, and you're producing more creatinine as a result. Your kidney function has not changed at all. It's just a product of having more creatine in total in your system. And I've had like doctors and other people and clients be like really worried because their creatinine went up because they were after they started taking creatine. There is at least one study where they used a much better marker of kidney function called cystatin C. And you can see that when people take creatinine goes up and cystatin C stays much more stable. Cystatin C is also a better marker of kidney function because it doesn't correlate with muscle mass. it's actually telling you only about the kidneys, whereas creatinine is telling you about like 3 or 4 things at the same time. So people who don't understand all of that think that when creatinine goes up after taking creatine, that your kidney function is worse. But that's just, it's not true. And studies where there's at least one study where they've specifically looked at that, and creatine does not negatively impact kidney function. If anything, it might improve it slightly, just because, right, your kidneys have more creatine and they need creatine for energy to do the work that they're doing. So no concerns about creatine and kidney function. And creatine is the most studied supplement of all time. Like sometimes I think like I'm too bullish about creatine. Like people will think that I think that it's a panacea. It's not a panacea. Of course, it's not going to fix everything. It's not going to magically prevent dementia or anything like that. Or it's also not going to make you like superhumanly strong. You've still got to like lift the weights in the gym. But they've done long-term studies giving high doses of creatine to frail older individuals, like people with Parkinson's disease, people with neurodegenerative diseases, and the side effects are very, very minimal, and certainly not including long-term kidney damage in people who are already old and frail. So I don't think that creatine and kidney function is something that people will have to worry about.
Okay, so you busted that myth, and it sounds like, in general, creatine's super safe. But are there any safety concerns with people taking, say, up to that higher dose of 30 grams a day?
Not that I've seen, but also not that I think people necessarily need to do that. There are studies where, in the majority of studies, you get most of the benefit, including increasing brain creatine content, improving mood. Right, there's now 2 or 3 studies where they've used creatine as an adjunct to treatment in depression. In all of those studies, like 5 to 10 grams a day is doing the trick. So I don't necessarily think that I don't think 30 grams, there's certainly no evidence that 30 grams is going to be detrimental. There have been studies like several years giving people 20 plus grams a day, seeing no negative effect. But I also think that most of the benefit probably comes at lower doses. So the only thing that you could say initially is that as you load creatine, so particularly if you start taking a high dose and you start getting as much creatine as possible into your cells, water does tend to move with it. So I have noticed some people feel a bit dehydrated when they first start to take higher doses of creatine, which is normal. That's just like water in the body redistributing itself with the creatine. So then if if on top of that you added a bunch of heat stress and sweating and all that kind of stuff, there's which people who are taking creatine and doing very heavy athletic type exercise and work, and they're losing a bunch of fluid, there's a slight possibility that could be an issue. But as long as you're making sure to hydrate properly, I think you can probably offset most of that.
All right, let's talk types, because there are a number of different types, and quality. What to look for in a quality creatine?
The simple answer is take creatine monohydrate and take Creapure. The Creapure is made by one company in Germany, and most supplement companies sell Creapure. They just white label the same thing. They have a very standardized process. It's well understood. Your Creapure has been used in most studies. That doesn't mean that non-Creapure sources of creatine monohydrate are worse. But we just that's the thing that most people have used, and we understand it. I think the best thing that you can do is get a creatine monohydrate source from a company that does third-party batch testing. There are examples, so like Thorne has one, Momentous has one. These are companies who, they're not making the creatine themselves. They're buying it from somewhere else, but then they're sending it out to make sure it doesn't have stuff that you don't want in it. So that's the best thing to do. Creatine monohydrate is by far the best studied. There's an increasing interest in a supplement called guanidino acetoacetate, GAA, which is a precursor to creatine. And there are some studies that suggest that it can increase body creatine levels more than taking creatine monohydrate. But at this point, I'm not necessarily convinced that the the source is a good enough quality that I would want to take it, and that it's more beneficial than taking creatine monohydrate. There's at least one study that showed that taking GAA increased homocysteine levels, which is like a marker of methylation, suggesting that maybe methylation isn't working as well as it should. But if you took regular creatine at the same time, that didn't happen. So if anybody's like delving into the weird and wonderful world of creatine and they want to take GAA, you probably should take it with regular creatine. There are some supplements on the market that have that. I yet wouldn't take it myself. I don't think because creatine has been studied so well for so long, I'm not yet ready to jump on the new bandwagon because we just don't really understand it the same. All the other forms of creatine, crealkaline, HCl, all these other like fancy forms, there's no evidence that they're any better than creatine monohydrate, and they're just more expensive. So I would just stick with what we know because we know it works.
Okay, so far we've talked on sleep deprivation, touched on the mental health piece, but what about brain health in general? And things like focus, reaction time, taking creatine, and even neural degeneration, things like dementia, being preventative for that.
There's certainly there's more than one paper that's been written as like a hypothesis that creatine could help to prevent cognitive decline, because it supports energetic status of the brain, which declines as we get older, and it declines in dementia. Again, right now most of that is hypothetical. However, there have been a couple of systematic reviews with meta-analyses looking at like what's the overall effect of creatine on cognitive function, particularly on memory. And it does seem to be beneficial, especially in those who are older and have already started to experience some decline. So while creatine probably isn't going to do a ton for your cognitive function on like a day-to-day basis, if you're not sleep deprived and everything else is good, fast forward 20, 30 years, if you start to see some decline, then creatine seems to have a bigger effect. There are some studies in athletes that suggest that creatine can boost cognitive function even in healthy people, but just like the overall burden of evidence suggests that the older you are, or if you've started to experience some deficit, creatine has more of an effect on cognitive function.
Let's bring it to performance, where creatine seems to have classically exploded. If somebody wants to use it for working out, what's the best timing with that? And then what type of exercise is it best for?
Yeah, so because of the way that creatine is used in the energy system, the shortest term energy system that we have is the phosphocreatine system, right? Then you have ATP produced through glycolysis, like anaerobic energy production. Then you have aerobic energy production through the mitochondria, like in terms of speed of production. And the amount that you can produce, like you can produce the least amount from the phosphocreatine system and the most amount, right? Essentially an unlimited amount from the aerobic system. So it's things that require very, very short-term, very fast energy production. So power and strength and sprint type workouts is where you're going to see most of your benefit from creatine, much less of an effect on long, sort of aerobic type work. So anything that requires explosive or very fast movement, you can, you're doing strength work in the gym, 3, 4, 5 reps. You can probably get, an extra rep with creatine, at least frequently enough that you can then start to be able to do more work. You can build more muscle and more strength. So that's the kind of work it seems to be particularly beneficial for. In terms of timing, there is a small amount of evidence that maybe taking it after a workout is better. But I think my interpretation of the evidence is that difference is probably so small that for most people, it doesn't really matter. And the reason why I say that is it's the best time to take it is the time that you're going to remember to take it and take it consistently. And, if it is stimulating for you, that it doesn't negatively affect your sleep. So the reason why I take it in the morning is because I just set out my morning supplements and then I take them and then I don't need to think about it. So if you prefer to have it in your pre-workout shake or your post-workout shake or in the morning, I think the most important thing, or you get the most benefit just by taking it consistently, the timing in the day is going to matter much less.
Unless we find out in the comments that it competes with caffeine.
Yeah, well, send me the papers. Unless I see the paper and understand the mechanism, then it's just hearsay.
As you're talking about these different benefits, including putting on muscle because we can have a better output in the gym, the cognitive benefits, to me, it's shouting out the fact that as people are aging, this would be such an important supplement as their cognition is naturally declining and muscle mass is declining.
Yeah, there has been a bit of work in that arena, at least from the cognitive function side. And then there was one big randomized controlled trial where they gave creatine 20 grams a day to postmenopausal women as part of a resistance training program. It did seem to maybe help improve some aspects of bone structure, when added to a resistance training program. But in that setting, like getting in the gym and doing the work is the most important thing. So I think part of where I would put this in the framework is that maintaining physical function and maintaining brain function, the most important thing is that you challenge those systems, right? You get in the gym or you do some kind of you don't have to be doing heavy deadlifts and whatever competing in powerlifting competitions, but resistance training, doing resistance to put mechanical tension on your muscles. That is what helps maintain muscle mass and bone mass as you get older. And the same is true for the brain. If you want to maintain cognitive function, you need to keep doing cognitively challenging things that then drive function. If creatine helps you to do that, right, it helps you get in the gym and work hard. It helps improve your focus slightly so that you can go and learn a musical instrument or go and have a stimulating conversation with somebody, then I think it's going to be beneficial. If you don't do those things and just sit at home doing nothing, taking creatine, it's not going to do that much. So if it enables you to do more work that stimulates function, great. But it's like on its own, it's not magic.
What about on the other end of the spectrum, kids? Has there been any research done on, below 10 kids taking creatine and any benefits there?
There's some studies in like youth athletics, so like maybe tweens and young teens. I don't think there's a ton in very young kids, except for in the world of pediatric concussion. Actually, probably some of the best evidence, and it's still quite small trials, but some of the best evidence that creatine can be beneficial after a concussion comes from a pediatric, like childhood concussion study. There are some review papers out there that suggest that taking creatine when you're younger is perfectly safe. Certainly no reason to be concerned about it. But I will say that there are also position statements from some like pediatrics groups that say that kids shouldn't take creatine. So I'm not gonna delve in there. You listen to the people that you need to listen to in that scenario. Because creatine is just like, it's a natural component, particularly of meat and fish, which, the kind of, to put stuff in context, the amount of creatine. So if you take like 5 to 10 grams of creatine, that's like a couple of tins of sardines, right? It's not, well, depending on the food, it's potentially easy, right? If you slammed back a few tins of sardines, you could get 20 to 30 grams of creatine. Like, people might not want to sit next to you, but the amount of creatine that we're talking is possible to get from the diet, which is why I think we can be confident that it's pretty safe. If you wanted to get that amount of creatine from beef or salmon, you're going to have to eat several pounds of it in a day, which some people can do and some people do. So, right, if you're eating that much meat, you probably don't need to supplement with creatine if that's the diet that works best for you. So one of the reasons why I'm not super concerned about specific groups taking creatine is because this is a level that we could get from the diet if we wanted to. It's not easy, but it's possible. So I think that kind of speaks to the safety range. Again, if people are thinking about it, and particularly when you're doing stuff in kids, and this is for everything. If drugs, any supplement, any intervention, And again, not suggesting that kids will have to be hosed down with creatine, but you then have to start thinking about dosing by body weight. So if you're going to do that, figure out a sort of like a safe calculation that makes sense in that case. Just because kids are much smaller, they're going to need a lot less of whatever it is we're talking about.
So it's found in animal products.
Yeah.
Is it found in plants at all?
Not that I know of. Certainly not in the kind of doses or contents that we're talking about.
Okay, because I've heard of a story, and I don't have the paper or anything, where it was either vegans or vegetarians taking creatine and having a mental boost from that. And obviously that makes sense with everything you're talking about and the fact that likely it's not even in plant products and it has all these benefits that we've been sharing. Have you heard about that paper I'm referring to?
Yes, but equally, people who are on omnivorous diets that eat meat also seem to see benefits from creatine. So it's probably most of us, regardless of the diet that we eat, are probably not consuming a lot of creatine unless it's a lot of meat and fish, which some people eat, but most people don't. That's not where the majority of their calories come from. The other part of this that potentially plays a role is the methylation system. So making creatine is it's like, if you're thinking about methylation as like the moving of methyl groups around things that like activates genes, it activates proteins and cells to do, like it's a really important way that we regulate metabolism is methylation. And it requires several B vitamins, B12, folate, B2, and B6 are the four main ones that are needed for methylation. And the majority of our methylation is used to make creatine. That's what we invest a lot of our methylation in. So people who are deficient in B vitamins required for methylation, or for some reason, right, their methylation system isn't working as well, they may get more benefit from taking creatine. This is entirely hypothetical. I've thought this. I haven't seen a study that says it, but it just kind of like, it makes sense based on what we do to make our own creatine, which we do constantly. So the reason why I say that is because some of the B vitamins that are critical for methylation are less found in plant-based diets and should be supplemented with if you're on a plant-based diet, particularly B12. So it could be like this knock-on effect, which is not that it's not because you're not eating enough creatine from your diet. It's that the creatine is helping offset a relative insufficiency of a B vitamin associated that's required for methylation. Does that make sense? So like that's one reason why people on plant-based diets may anecdotally see more benefit from creatine is if there are other vitamins in that system that they need more of.
If all the nutrients are in place and the body can make what it wants, creatine-wise, do we know how much it'll make in a day?
Great question. I'm sure somebody does, but I don't.
I'm just curious if it's around the 5 gram range and we're adding another 5 with supplementing or what.
Yeah, that's a very good question. I don't know the answer to that. Maybe somebody could put that in the comments and then you can tell me.
We're going to be busy in the comments. Thank you guys. If you enjoyed that clip, you're going to want to head over here and catch a full episode. I'll see you over there.
This traditional idea that eating lots of carbs, that spikes lots of insulin, and then that causes insulin resistance, in and of itself, I don't think that that's actually what's happening. As people become metabolically unhealthy, or they become insulin resistant, there does seem to be this